to deal with some of the technical details of a doctrine, but to rather give us a broad panoramic view of what I see in the Word as the plan and program of God as it is revealed to us. We feel, along with Adam Clarke, that everything God does has something of mystery connected with it. Whenever God puts the word mystery on any given thing or subject, that subject is too deep for my measuring rod or yours or ours or all men. When God calls a thing a mystery, it's a mystery. And there are several mysteries in the word of the Lord. Mystery of iniquity, the mystery of godliness, the mystery of God, the mystery of the faith. And you can look at whatever God does, and the human mind is not able to grasp. I can only hope to have some little measure of understanding of the revelation that God gives me through His Word. That Word is the last, the highest authority. So far as I am concerned, whatever I read in it is final. I have been up against, in years gone by, the things that I suppose most preachers come up against. I have been up against liberalism. I've been up against fanaticism. And I'm very, very loath to put the word fanatic upon anybody or anything, and yet, in all fairness, I must when I know what certain things lead to. Now, I make a distinct difference between an extremist and a fanatic. One may be an extremist and yet not be a fanatic. There's something about fanaticism that has a weird spirit attached to it, with a grip that nobody knows unless you have come to grips with it. I mean, if you come to grips with it, there's something about fanaticism that is gripping. I do not have the answer to a lot of things, but quickly to pass by this point, my early ministry, some wildfire broke out in a neighboring church, a German Methodist church to be exact, and it was good people. It started with good people who I believe wanted, the great body of the people I believe wanted the will of God, wanted to do the will of God. And they had some leadership, however, that had gotten off the beam, and denominationalism had crowded in a little, and they were wanting to push their own denomination rather than, or maybe ahead of, I should say. Or how could I put that? They couldn't see how the work could go unless it took their denomination along up too. Well, actually, I have never felt that way. I felt God's work must go, and wherever He wants to start His work, I'll do my part, and I'm sure if I keep my place, He'll see that I have everybody I can take care of. That was the way I worked as a pastor. Well, this broke out, and with prayer and fasting, they gave themselves to prayer and fasting until, as one woman said, my body's so weak I can hardly stand, and I believe that was true. But that didn't change the fact that there was something wild and weird about it. The first time I went to their services, I wasn't in the community when it broke out, but a woman slid out of the pew about halfway down when the preacher finished, and she started walking down the aisle with what to me was a kind of a snaky movement. She had her hands clasped, and she'd writhe and twist and twitch and stop occasionally and make ejaculations. Oh, she'd say, somebody is crossing the deadline, and then a kind of a weird atmosphere. She'd go to people and just, with that look on her face, and tell them they were at or near the deadline, and they lined the altar. The altar was lined night after night. Well, when I went to the service, the church was jammed. It was a country church, a good-sized church, but out in the country. And I actually had to shoulder my way through the vestibule to get into the auditorium. I didn't get into the main auditorium, but in the prayer room at the rear. And that's where I stood through the service listening, and that's where I saw this woman move. Well, I knew nothing of what the issues, of any strange issues, except the whole thing seemed strange. But when they called them to the altar to pray, I could only get about the end of the third pew, somewhere along there down the aisle. And I knelt there, and after praying maybe 5 minutes, I lifted my face and looked, and on the front seat was a woman with a baby on her lap, and she was turned toward me with her hands out like bird's claws and making funny motions toward me, just kind of, and a wild look in her face. And I watched her a moment and wondered what it was all about. Well, I prayed again, bowed my head and prayed again, and when I looked up, after another 4 or 5 minutes, she was still doing it. I still didn't know what it was all about. I was praying again when this other woman who had started down the aisle, how she got to me, I don't know. But she put her hands on my head and screamed. And then she said, Brother Emery, your people are worshiping you as their God. They're holding you in too high regard. They're worshiping you as your God. And she screamed again and left me. Well, it was all rather in the fog until the thing cleared up. I won't give you the tale because it ran long, but to say this, that in that community, it didn't just stay there, it came over into our service. When my evangelist came, and my evangelist for that meeting was E.E. Shellhammer. If any of you old-timers know E.E., you know that he was a character by himself, but he was God's man for that service at that time, because it broke out in our service. And this woman, one night when 29 seekers were at the altar and maybe 75 praying people, she came on the platform and dropped on her knees behind me, began pounding me on the back and screaming, "Mine God, brother, mine God." Brother Shellhammer stopped her. The old-timers were very, very careful about women putting their hands on men or vice versa. Very, very careful about that. We're in a day when that's becoming a kind of a social problem. Anybody's free to do anything they want, but that was not so back there. And so he said to her, "Keep your hands off him. Don't you put your hands on him." She jumped up and screamed, "This is of God, this is of God." Started to walk across the platform and stepped right off into the air like she's going to walk on it. But she fell prostrate on the floor, and Brother Shellhammer rose from his seat, and I grabbed him by the coat. I jerked his coattail, and I said, "Brother, don't do anything for my sake." I said, "The Lord will take care of this." Well, Shellhammer was one of those old-timers, you know. He looked at me with those eagle eyes, and he said, "You never mind. If you needed skinning, I'd skin you as quick as anybody." But he walked over, stood on the platform above the lady, and he everlastingly rebuked her. But now here's the thing I started. I didn't intend to get all of this in. I don't understand this. One of the most godly men I have ever known in my life, a Wesleyan Methodist pastor. Pastored a little church, some circuit, in fact, 3-4 miles from where I was, the nearest church. But that man yielded to that spirit and went to the altar. That's what they wanted me to do, yield to that spirit. And in my praying and fasting, I felt the Lord had revealed to me that demons were operating in the community, and among them were suicide demons. You say, that's weird. Well, I know that. And now you're getting off the beam. Well, I'm not. But I had that feeling in my heart, just a little crossroad village, no railroad, no bus station. Brought the mail in, like I presume they do here on a rural route. I don't know how you get it here, but just one mail a day came in on the rural route. But this Wesleyan man yielded to that spirit, and it broke him mentally. He tried to drown himself in his cistern. They fished him out, and before they could stop him, he ran across the road and jumped in the mill pond, and they fished him out of there, took him to the jail, put him in the padded cell, and on to the asylum. I saw him about a little over a year after that, at a campground, broken in health, broken in mind. One time a rugged body, as rugged as mine. He came to me, he said, Brother Emery, he said, I saw hell. He was very vigorous then. Said it was like a trolley wire stretched from heaven to my head. Something came down that wire, hit me in the head. And then he became tense and he said, I saw hell. And he shuddered and said, I think I better not talk about it. And I guessed he'd better not either. But he only lived another year and died. The very preacher that was in charge of that group at that time tried to commit suicide a year later. I went to him and prayed with him and tried to help him. Across the road from where we held meetings, a young man, married 6 months, committed suicide the last Sunday morning of our revival. Down the road 3 miles, a man hung himself in a neighbor's barn. A little farther down, another fellow hung himself in his own woodshed. Over here, a fellow blew his head off with a shotgun. Over here, a man shot himself with a deer rifle. Just a little country community. Somebody said, I'm not afraid of wildfire. I am. You would be too if you'd gone through some of the things I'm talking about. Somebody said, better have a little wildfire than none. No, sir. Fire under control is the greatest blessing you ever had, one of them, but fire out of control can destroy more than you can build. And it doesn't take it long. Well, now here's what I started to say, and all of that I had no intention of saying. But before that preacher committed or tried to commit suicide, the man who was in charge, after Brother Shellhammer had rebuked this woman, he came to me and said, Brother Emery said, we could have settled that thing if your evangelist had kept his nose out of it. Well, I said we could if you would have accepted the Bible as supreme authority. Said that's the highest tribunal to which we may come. He thought a minute. He shook his head. He said, no. He said the Holy Ghost is the author of the Bible and he's higher authority than the Bible. Well, I said we couldn't get together in 10,000 years on that premise, and I left him. Whenever we put anything above the Bible, then we're on thin ice. For this is God's revelation to you and to me, and I accept it as that. Now, what we've been dealing with in the past, If you're new here, we started out with the business of God, looking a little at the being of God, God in being. We started with Psalm 89, verse 14. We endeavored to get at the subject by thinking about man. For the record is that God made man in his own image and after his own likeness. Our proposition is, or was, and is, that man fell and lost the moral image, but he did not lose the personality image. All the faculties that go to make up personality, man has, and God has. That is, God has a faculty of sight. I have a faculty of sight. We worked in that area. I looked through an organ, physical organ. God doesn't have the physical organ, but he has the faculty. I listen through a physical organ. God hears, but he doesn't have the organ. And all of the faculties of personality that I know about, God has, for I was made in his image and after his likeness. Then we talked a little about God's placing the man in the garden, and we made this observation, which we haven't gone any farther with, that it's long been my conviction that in the beginning the land mass of this earth was one great body of land. Seas were gathered together in one place, and God put man in a garden eastward in Eden. I stated that I have long believed that the land of Palestine was the site of the original Garden of Eden. We may say a little more about that. But from this place, the man was put with and given an helpmeet with some duties. He was to be fruitful, they were to be fruitful, multiply, replenish the earth, and subdue it. That is, they were to rule over the earth from that center point. Now, if you'll keep that in mind, that'll fit into some things that I want to say a little later, maybe not this morning, but I'll give you this much by way of suggestion. I have long believed that it was near the city of Jerusalem, what we know of as the city of Jerusalem, that the first man, Adam, fell into sin, died in sin. I do not think it was just a coincidence that the last Adam came to the same place to die, for where the first man died in sin, the last Adam died for sin. I will be working on that line a little bit. I don't think that's just a coincidence. There are a number of things that lead me to think this. For instance, when God told Abram to take his son Isaac, first of all, when he called Abram and told him to come back to a land that I'll show thee, that land there's something significant about it. Then he told him to take his son over to Mount Moriah. Well, if it was only a matter of sacrificing his son, he could have done that in the front yard. But he took him to a place, and up that same hill, the Son of God came centuries later, riding on a donkey, riding to the place of sacrifice. But for the moment, or for the day, for the morning hour, I'd like to go back and gather up some things that we were in the other day, and as I suggested, I get quite a lot of questions, both here and outside. Folks talk to me about something I may have said. We stopped yesterday with man at the time, or up to the time of the flood, the antediluvian period. We had put a little stress on the fact that by one man sin entered into the world. God nowhere charges the woman with responsibility for bringing it into the world. We quoted 1 Timothy 2:14. If you want to look it over, Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived was in the transgression. And we pointed out Romans 5:12, that by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin. Pointing out that the woman is never charged with the responsibility for bringing it in, but rather the man. Now, in thinking in this area, it may be good for me to point out this. If you preachers especially, and laity too, if you'll keep these two words separated in your thinking, penalty and consequences, just divide those words and keep them separate. One may suffer consequences without being penalized. You and I are suffering the consequences of Adam's transgression, but not the penalty. Now, I have long believed, in fact, for years, I do not know that I ever believed, because maybe I wasn't thinking fast enough or far enough, and maybe I got started in on a road of thinking, a line of thinking, that gave me guidance. But I have never been able to believe that physical death is any part of the penalty for sin. Now, I know that crosses with the great majority of theologians, because they say there are three phases to the penalty. I say the penalty fell the very day Adam sinned. The consequences of that penalty are physical death and eternal death, but the penalty was right there that day. Now, if physical death is any part of the penalty, then that part of the penalty no man has been delivered from, for all have died from then till now. If physical death was a part of the penalty, then it was an ex post facto law or statement, because it was not said to Adam that until thou return to the dust, until after he had sinned. He had already committed his act when he was told that he would go back to the dust from whence he came. So that I'm thinking, if you want something good to read, and it's, as Brother Van Warmer said regarding Brother Wilcox's book, it isn't a book you can sit down and just read over like fiction tale. You're going to have to think, and this book is extremely hard to get. You could only get it as a used book, but it was written by an old Methodist man, somewhere about 1860 or 70, somewhere along there. The immortality of the soul and final condition of the wicked, carefully considered, by R.W. Landis. And it's the greatest book on that subject that I have ever read. Back in the other century, there were a lot of books written on both heaven and hell. We don't have much of anything in this generation, but you had back there Life and Death Eternal by Bartlett, Lost Forever by Townsend, Facts and Theories of this, of the other state, and at the end of the century, one of the best books for reference work that I know, That Unknown Country, a compilation in which you have every shade of opinion that was in circulation then regarding the condition of men who die without God. But Landis takes this matter up and deals with it, to my mind, as well as I have ever had it dealt with anywhere. But you get the idea that consequences may follow, though they are not penal. And here you come to some things that I do not have the answer for. Some things God has left in the counsels of his own will that I do not know why, and I do not question God. His providences are too deep for me. But one of the things that hit me as a high school lad, I was converted one time while in high school for just a few weeks. Without any help in my home, I I was home for the weekend and was converted and went back to high school, living alone in a little room and trying to go to school, carry papers to help pay my way. But I ran on to a verse of Scripture. To my knowledge, I had never read anything in the Word of God. Somebody said there are 10 commandments. I didn't know what they were, much less where. But I knew an old man. I'd seen him reading a Bible. So I went to him, and everybody called him Uncle Charlie. And I said to him, Uncle Charlie, where are the 10 commandments? And I paused to ask you, if a high school boy were to come to you and ask you, where are the 10 commandments, could you tell him? Would you have to call the parsonage and ask the preacher? Well, that's dead. I'm dead in earnest. I'm not going to take a vote this morning, but in my heart, I wonder how many of you know where the 10 commandments are. Suppose a high school lad were to just walk up, say to you, and you would have to say, I don't know. Wouldn't that be something? Would you know the 10 commandments if you saw them? Are you sure? I stood beside the door in a preacher's home. That man is a district superintendent now. And he was up, well up, one of the in the higher echelon. I stood beside the door on a winter day, had my overcoat on. There was a plaque motto beside the door. He was out in the kitchen getting his final instructions from the head of the culinary department. And I was looking that motto over, and when he came out, I said, that isn't the 10 commandments. That's what it said at the top, the 10 commandments. He backed off and looked at it, and he said, why isn't it? Well, I said, they left one out, and they split one other one in two to make 10. What do you have hanging on your wall? Huh? Which one had they left out? Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image. And they had split number 10 in two to make 10. He didn't know. Well, I didn't know, but I found where the 10 commandments were from this brother. And I started to read, and this is where I stopped. The Lord thy God is a jealous God, visiting the iniquities of the fathers on the children, even unto the third and the fourth generation of them that. And you know, I can't understand that, but it hit me hard. The devil jumped me and said, Emery, you couldn't go to heaven if you wanted to. Said, see, your father's sins are going to be put on you. He's dead. He died. Never was a Christian, never went to church. Your grandfather's dead, and he never went to church. And you don't know where there's any Christians in your ancestry. And here it is, visiting the iniquities of the fathers on the children. You couldn't go to heaven if you wanted to. And I would tell you, gentlemen, if anything like that ever hits you, it'll take all the frivolity out of you. You young people, if it ever strikes you that you couldn't go to heaven, maybe you'd want to go then. That's kind of the way we're made. We want to do what we think we are. Somebody says you can't do. But I don't understand. And I said, yet it's a mercy of God that he said unto the third and the fourth generation, the consequences of a man's sin may linger and break out down the road somewhere, the consequences. You don't sin and have it stop right there. I don't know why I seem to be in this area this morning. I'm wanting to get into something else, but it'd be all right, wouldn't it, if I stick here a little bit? I had a woman doing some deaconess work for me one time. As fine a Christian woman as I ever knew. She lived in our home and did some deaconess work. One day she went to the doctor. She had a rash on her arm, and the doctor gave her some ointment. She came back. After a few days, she went back again. It hadn't helped any. The doctor sent her to the hospital. When she came back from the hospital, I noticed she was agitated quite a little. And she was gathering her clothing up. They'd ordered her to the hospital. I received a call from a doctor. I had a friend who was on the staff. He told me to bring my two older daughters with me. When I saw him start to examine those two girls, I said to him, "Doctor, does that young woman have social disease?" In a rather professional way, he said yes. Well, I was very much interested right away. They charged her immediately with immorality. She resented it. She demanded a physical examination to prove her innocence. And I didn't know all that was going on, but I did tell this friend of mine, a Free Methodist medical man, that I wanted to know. I said, "I'm a pastor," and he saw my position. And the doctor on the floor, the ward, I said, "I want to know." And when they obtained the report at the window out in the office, I stopped as I was going in, and I said to the woman, "Do they have any report on this matter?" She knew about it. Yes. She said, "We don't know how she obtained or how she contracted this." Then she said, "The sins of the father you know." Hospital. The sins of the father you know. The doctors both pronounced the woman innocent, but here she has something that she's inherited. We don't know whether it was her father, her mother. When you get to grandparents, you have 4, great-grandparents, you have 8, and you're all of them down. It could come to the 3rd and the 4th generation, and it's a mercy of God that nobody can look back and say it was there. But I tell you, there are awful consequences that go with sin. I'm going to say some more. If I don't get back to what I want, I feel that I should say some things here. I knew a man, knew him well. You young men, if there are any young men here. I knew this man well. He had contracted social disease and had doctored and been pronounced cured. A couple of years had gone by. He married. And then in the matter of a couple of years, they had a little one born out in a big farmhouse in the country. They called a doctor, came to the home, baby was born. The doctor took care of the mother and the babe, stepped away from the bed, took the young man by the arm, walked him through the house, the living room, the dining room, out onto the back porch. And standing there on the porch alone, said, "When did you have so-and-so?" The man had to own up. The doctor said, "I saw it in your baby's eyes." I tell you, sin doesn't die right here. The baby lived 6 months and died, though not from that. 2 or 3 years, they had another little one come in the same bedroom, but not the same doctor. Didn't want that doctor back again. Another doctor. The other doctor went in, did the same thing, took care of the wife, the babe, and when he was through, took the young man by the arm and led him through the same rooms, out to the same porch, and said to him, "When did you have this?" And once again, he had to own up that I had it thus and so. I wish I could press that on. You don't get by some things. That child lived 3 or 4 years and died, but not from that, as far as I know. I don't know what happened when the next one was born, but I do know that happened to the first 2. So I don't understand the consequences, or why the consequences, but there's a penalty that fell that very day. The consequences of that act of Adam have been going on from then till now. That's what I'm after. Penalty is one thing, consequences may be something else. They may drop on the individual that has nothing to do with that original. They fall, but I do not have the answer for that. Now, nor do I know any man. It's locked up in the secret counsels of God Almighty. But he knows how to straighten everything out when the time comes. Well, let's go back now for the few minutes I have left and begin at the ark. We came through the antediluvian period, suggested that 2 men's lives spanned that whole period. Adam and Methuselah were contemporaries for 243 years. And the condition on earth was a very, very serious condition. In fact, you take a look at the 6th and 7th chapters of Genesis, and the situation on earth is the same as, or the one that's ahead of us is to be the same as it was back there, if we're not in it right now. Genesis 6 verse 5, the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thought of his heart was only evil continually. I tell you, we're fast reaching a place where few men, few women have thoughts of holiness and goodness and godliness. The devil is busy throwing things into the mind of everybody. And as a child of God, the battlefield of your soul is in your mind. One of my co-laborers made the statement, was it last night, that your mind is the battleground. He didn't put it just like that, but everything that comes to you comes through the medium of your mind. They're trying to outlaw pornographic literature, but they aren't getting very far. It's just scattered until young men, young women walk in the book stands and walk down the street and look at billboards, and whatever you see, it appeals to something other than a holy heart. Everything. What you listen to, what you hear. I've often said if I was a millionaire, multimillionaire or something, I'd like to do it anyway. When I see these big billboards with a smiling face of a man and maybe some bottle pictured beside him like Sunnybrook or What will you beside him? As though that's what made him happy, or some kind of beer, that's what made him happy. I'd like to take some real pictures, not just paint an imaginary one. I'd like to take some real pictures and have them enlarged and put a billboard just beyond that one and put a big sign, "This is the end." You wouldn't have to draw on your imagination at all. I think of a night I went down to the mailbox after service in Baltimore, Maryland. I'd held a meeting and there was a mailbox about 3-4 blocks away. I did some writing and I went down to mail some letters. And right across the street was a drinking place. And as I was coming up to the mailbox, the door opened and a man came out of there just head first. He was being just pitched out. And he sprawled on the sidewalk. Man with a white apron stood in the doorway. And the man groveled around a bit and got up, and reeling, he was going to go right back in. But the man stood there, threatened him what would happen if he did. And after a bit, the man reeled around and finally went over and sat down on the ledge in front of the window. I'd like to have had a picture of that. Put that on a big billboard, right beyond that one. So they'd look at this and then see that. That's the end. Sin has a glamour, a glitter to it. And yet it leads to this very situation. The wickedness of man was great. Go over into go on down in chapter 6, verse 11. The earth was corrupt before God and filled with violence. And that statement is repeated in verse 13. The earth was filled with violence through them. Corruption and violence everywhere in the world because of the sin in man, through them. Get those two words, through them. The earth was filled with violence. Well, as a result, God said he was going to destroy them from off the face of the earth. Now, the idea that man was a caveman and comes up out of a primitive condition. May I submit to you that there have been those conditions through the years, and those conditions are obtaining right now here in America. You go down where I expect to be in a couple of weeks, the Lord willing. You go out to Kansas City or to St. Louis, Missouri, and if 10,000 years from now those cities would be buried, somebody would dig down and find what is in St. Louis now and what's in Kansas City. They might say, well, they had a very high culture at that period. But you go over the mountain about 100 miles or 150 and dig down in the Ozarks and find some of the things you could find there, and you might say, well, that's 50,000 years earlier. But it's right here now. You go out to Pueblo, they call it the Pittsburgh of the West. Dig down there, and you discover some of the things that you have in this area. But you go over the mountain and dig into one of those hogans, those Indian hogans, and you'd say, why, that must be 50,000 years earlier. But it's right here now. We don't have to say that because I found this and this. Well, they could be right along contemporary, and they are. The earth filled with violence, but one of the evidences of the ability of this man Noah is the fact that he could build an ark such as he built. Now, I built a few old clam scows in my young manhood. Used to do some clam fishing. But I always wanted to soak them up a little. After I built the boat, even after I painted it, and I'd lead the joints. I'd do my best to make it watertight, but nearly always there'd be a little seepage here or there. But brother, here's a man that built an ark Somebody said that 300 cubits long, 450 feet, but I think commentaries would tell you it's more likely to have been 500 or 525 feet long, and it had to be watertight from the beginning. And I must declare to you, I don't know enough to build a thing like that. I'm not a builder. Maybe some of you men are. And you could go ahead and build an ark the size that ark was and have it watertight from the very beginning, but I contend that the man who engineered that had something between his ears to keep them from rubbing together. That man Noah was nobody's numbskull. He certainly had some ability, or he couldn't have made the ark. Well, then there's another couple of other items. My time is running out, but a couple of other items I'd like you to get to, because I may not come back to this, and yet if I do, I want it to refer to. In the first chapter of Genesis, are we warranted in thinking that there were no carnivorous beasts on the earth at this time? For in verse 29 and verse 30, the record is, I have given you every herb bearing seed which is upon the face of all the earth, and that is for both man and beast. Then I used to wonder, as a little fellow, I was taken visiting one time, and I must have been at a circus somewhere, because I remember distinctly that I looked at that picture on the wall, and it was supposedly a picture of Noah's Ark with the gangplank up, and the animal all marching up in ranks of twos or fours, or they were walking up the gangplank, and out beside were some men standing with staffs in their hand. And as a boy, I wondered, how in the world did those men get that lion and tiger and rhinoceros and hippopotamus? How'd they get them to walk up that plank? You never know what's going on in a boy's or a girl's mind, you know. This will illustrate that you don't know what's going on. Some teacher asked a little girl, what are those pointed shoes that women are wearing now good for? Little girl stuck her hand up. She said, squashing bugs in corners. She'd seen some woman do that. and that's what she thought they were good for. Well, I couldn't figure that out. I never asked anybody. My mother didn't know what was going on. The woman didn't know what was going on in my mind. She didn't know. But you know, one day after I got in the ministry, I read this in Genesis 9. God blessed Noah and his sons and said unto them, be fruitful and multiply, replenish the earth. Same thing that had been said to Adam. And the fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth, and upon every fowl of the air, upon all that moveth upon the earth, and upon all the fishes in the sea. Into your hand are they delivered. Now, I gathered from that prior to the flood, there was no fear of man upon the animal kingdom. That solved the problem. Why, they could easily be brought into the ark. If they weren't afraid of man, there was no animosity. And it was at this point that man became a meat eater. Up to this point, he'd lived on the herb of the field, but now everything that moveth upon the earth wherein there is life, I have given you for meat, even as the green herb have I given you all things. What was the change that came upon the earth here as a result of the flood? Then the idea that in Genesis chapter 2 at verse 5, I think, God had not caused it to rain upon the earth. But after the rain had come and the flood had subsided, the covenant was made. I'll put my bow in the heavens. And the raindrops in the clouds are the means by which the bow is revealed as the covenant of God, that he'll not again destroy the earth with a flood. But now in closing, I'll give you one verse to which we may come somewhere down the road. You ponder it a little. In Acts chapter 3, I think it's verse 21, Peter is talking and he's saying the heavens are to receive Jesus Christ. And the verse reads, whom the heavens must receive until the times of the restitution of all things. In other words, Christ disappeared in the heavens, and he's to stay there until the times for the restitution of all things. What does that restitution of all things imply? What does it involve? What all will happen when things are restored again to their Edenic condition? You work on that if you will. All right, that's all for the morning. Whoever has charge of it.